Again, thank you for coming and turning out here, and I'm excited to delve into this because I love finding out who people were, and I'm going to also talk about what happened where, kind of put a little more of a face on the topography as well. We've got this great map up here, which I'll get to later in the talk, but here's Salem, South River, North River. It's a really wide place, and you all are very familiar with that. In Marblehead, where I come from, for the last 30 years anyway, we're not so aware of what Salem had been. And so I'm giving this talk also in Marblehead the weekend after the big reenactment in Lexington and Concord, because that could have happened in Marblehead and then Salem so easily, so easily. Lot of tensions. I think BJ hit the nail on the head. There was so much tension already at that time, and it's really amazing that everything kept a lid on it. That everybody who was involved here in Salem kept a lid on it. So let's find out who these people were. And I updated it to 4 colonels because I realized there was a 4th. So missed the PR for that. But here's Jeff Schwartz here on the left, being Timothy Pickering, because he was involved there too and had just become a colonel before that, recently before that. So I hope you've all seen the excellent exhibit at the National Park Service Visitor Center, and maybe even heard Emily Murphy's really good talk about about the event, the episode, and myth busting a lot of it, because people talk and alternative facts are nothing new. But the exhibit is really good, so go see it. It'll be up through April 27th, which is the date I'll be doing my program in Marblehead. And they have a timeline of kind of what led up to April 19th. And on that timeline, April 19th is on the bottom. And the so-called Boston Massacre, I think, is up at the top. So these are especially in 1774, there were a number of volatile events. And so many of those could have really erupted, and as could this one especially. And I love this statement that Emily wrote in the Park Service. The event, now remembered as Last Easter Retreat, was one in a series of political and military confrontations between colonists and the royal governor, General Thomas Gage, between 1773 and 75. So that scene that's in Lexington obviously could have been Marblehead or Salem. So I hope some of you went to the reenactment. Did any of you go to it? Good. I know some of you were in it. But it was really, really fascinating and excellent, and there will be a video about it on the Salem 400 website. So I hope you can go tap into that and see what happened there. But there they are on the bridge, and the reenactment of the standoff with Colonel Alexander Leslie and his 240, by that time, exhausted, cold, angry, heavily armed, hungry British troops. And maybe angry should have gone at the end there, because all of that would have made them angry. And then they're standing in the cold after having marched the 4 miles at quick step, probably, because we'll talk about that. I'll talk about the timing in a little bit. They had to get here fairly quickly before nightfall. So it could have ended in a bloody attack on civilians. We'll talk about that a little bit more, about what Marblehead was. And our citizens, as you probably have heard, were pretty volatile themselves. It's a gritty town. They're out there at sea. They're tough people. And they're pretty much unemployed because it's winter and the restraining acts are coming. They're going to take effect in March. And that restricts fishing out at the North Atlantic. That's the entire town's livelihood. Our town is going to be really angry. We're about 96% rebel in Marblehead. Similar to Danvers, not a third, which is pretty typical. We're all in, or all out, somewhere. So then you have the taunting of the redcoats in Salem, and the citizens are pretty angry in Salem too. So any one of those things could have resulted in an outcome that Colonel Leslie would not have wanted, even himself. So instead, those rising tensions were resolved peacefully. And there's Charlie in the red. In our first reenactment, I think, was that 2017? Because I was on the Lexington committee when we all went to coffee and kind of thought this thing up with stagecraft and everything. So through restraint, measured communication, negotiation, and respect. And those qualities, hello, come on in.
Thank you.
Those qualities, a chair right up front if you want. Right here.
Oh, great.
Easy peasy. Those qualities are what we need now in our country, right? It's what we need now in the world. So here's an example of where it solved a problem, but only for 7 weeks. So I think those things are a lot to ask for. So, excuse me, before or even as darkness was falling, the British regulars left Salem and retreated, also peacefully, with no shots fired. So that whole retreat is an important part of it. Think of the retreat from Lexington and Concord through Menotomy. That didn't happen here. So by about 4 p.m., excuse me, the British troops marched back to their transport ship, which was anchored in Marblehead Harbor. You'll see that pretty soon. And the Marblehead militia probably fell in behind them as they marched. So I love this. I love that picture. It's just so evocative of the sunset and the resolve on their faces. And Marbleheaders, as I said, were pretty gritty folks. Any of you watch Deadliest Catch on Discovery Channel? Those are the Marbleheaders, right? So then came to within Marblehead's bounds. So later on, that was called, this whole event, the whole episode was called a retreat. But I think the more important part is this negotiation there in the center. And this wonderful, wonderful illustration that has, go see it at the Park Service because you can pick out so many details, and even Sarah Tarrant up there in the window, or that's not, I guess that's not what Sarah Tarrant, I said, I take that back. She was on the road nearby shouting out from her house, Alicia. And she was Sarah Tarrant. And but the warehouse of the distillery there, those are pretty rough workers too. So they could be in business. So you all know where the North River Bridge is. In Marblehead, we're not maybe quite as up on that. But I love this logo. And there was the bridge over on the left. And this map, which I'll plunk in for Marblehead, I'll take a picture of this later, but shows you the South and the North Rivers. And the British troops had to march, the regular army troops had to march across the South River Bridge and then come up to the North River. And there it is now, 300 feet wide, as I think somebody in your panel, this was an excellent panel, I hope somebody went to that was here February 15th. And if not, watch the video on that because that's fascinating as well. So there's a drawbridge in the middle. This is a big span, but the drawbridge would have been in the middle. And apparently, Colonel David Mason, on the other side, the north side of the drawbridge where the cannons were stored, climbed to the drawbridge so he could talk to Colonel Leslie. This is from the pictures in the Park Service Visitor Center. And there's the illustration of that, the detail of the illustration. So this is another artist rendering of what the drawbridge could have looked like. Probably was a little larger than that for bigger boats to go through. But that was in the Boston Globe in 1975. Cool. They kind of had the concept in a way. And you see them in the front hacking apart the gondolas, the transport, little mini barges, so that the British couldn't use those. So I love this picture. I think it's great from the Boston Globe. And it's the shot not heard round the world. And today, of course, on the front page of the Globe, you might have seen there's a story about the confrontation between Lexington and Concord about who was first. It seems pretty cut and dry, but whatever.
Right?
Another cool picture from a later time period. So there still was a drawbridge for, rowboats, probably later in the 1800s as the river was silting up and becoming more like it is today, or a little more so. But some good imagery and postcard from the 1990s, from the 1900s of the bridge. So the British regulars were allowed to, after this confrontation, because you can learn all about that in the exhibit and the reenactment, they crossed the bridge and they were allowed to go as far as Mason Street. So that's where the Citgo station is, right? Where you hang a left and go out to Tremont Street to go up to 128 if you want to avoid 114. So that's as far as they marched, and then they turned back, wheeled around again, as they say, and marched back all the way to Marblehead. I don't know when these guys got to eat, because they left at about 2 in the morning, left Boston, and they probably got home about 2 in the morning. Well, no, they didn't. They got home later in the morning, because they left Marblehead at 4 in the morning. They got home later. So these guys hadn't eaten. These poor Sunday afternoon, after the alarm sounded, the Marblehead militia would have formed into companies. They're knocking on all the doors of the churches, and it's a darn good thing everyone was in church because everybody could be warned very easily all at once. Mm-hmm. And you have to ask, well, I'll ask this later. As it turns out, Marblehead's militia did not actually go into Salem. Emily Murphy spelled this out really well, so look more at that video about that. But the rebels, the Patriots, were not supposed to be confrontational. They weren't supposed to appear confrontational. So Marblehead's militia probably kind of cooled their heels and waited, just as Danvers' militia did not cross the drawbridge either. They stayed off a little ways and waited. They had a tavern to wait at. I don't know if the Marbleheaders, if they were at the Forest River, there's not much around there, so they probably just had to cool their heels in the cold. But they were all at the ready if needed, and maybe Marblehead marched a little further than that. It's hard to know, but they could not appear provocative, so they were not at that confrontation. And even in that picture, you can see that there are no militias really pictured. Maybe those folks in the back were people, but in the way back on the right, but I'm not so sure that they are. So I think this image captures it pretty well. So here's some of Marblehead's typical militia of our Marblehead Regiment, which is such a great regiment of enthusiasts. Then they have an encampment at Fort Sewell every year in the summer, the weekend after 4th of July. So come out to see that if you want to. Marblehead's militia was a sizable force, actually. In 1775, it was by May it was 600 people almost, and all but 6 were from Marblehead, and that's because the whole town was unemployed because of the restraining acts. So they had been training with Colonel Timothy Pickering, and we would have trained. Our militia would have trained on the Common, which is where Abbott Hall now stands. You all know probably Abbott Hall in Marblehead. But that was the training field. That was Training Field Hill. And later on, we had an arch just like Salem does, or did, with a medallion of George Washington carved by Samuel McIntyre.
Oh, wow.
Who knew?
Where'd it go?
The medallion is in the Marblehead Historical Society in the Lee Mansion. The arch fell apart, just like yours did. Yours got rebuilt. Ours hasn't. It probably won't be. But Timothy Pickering, and thank you, Jeff, for standing in here. He was trained, he was promoted to colonel just like a few weeks before this, sometime in that February, I think, from what I learned on February 15th. And John Glover of Marblehead, who's our famous colonel, later general, and Timothy Pickering, of course, was later general too. He was a major and then a lieutenant colonel, so he was not the colonel of Marblehead's militia at this point. He was 43, so that's getting a little old compared to some of the others who were involved in this event. Colonel Tim, as you guys call him, was 30. Yes, stand up. That's what he would have looked like. This would have been him. I think you're reincarnated.
I'm 34, so.
Well, that's
close
enough.
Oh my God!
Yeah, you're really getting a little.
I know.
Right over there.
I remember he was 15
So
over.
craggy.
So, the news of Marblehead's resolve and action made it as far as New York City, because in January 1776, the New York Gazette reported, pretty much, think of this in a sarcastic tone of voice, or jeering, the madmen of Marblehead are preparing for an early campaign against His Majesty's troops. It's kind of, can you get a load of that? So they already had a reputation, and I love this picture. This is awesome. It's Don Trioni. Thank you. I forgot to put that on there. I found it on the Tea Party Museum website. So he was a new colonel, and he became a general in 1777, the same year Colonel Glover did. So there he is, a little more aged in years, but maybe in his 40s or 50s there in the portrait. Lovely portrait. And he was at the standoff at the bridge. So more on that in the exhibit, and talk to Jeff about that. As you all know, but the Marblehead folks might not have as much, Secretary of War, then Secretary of State under both the first and second U.S. presidents, George Washington and John Adams. And then later, a Massachusetts state representative and a U.S. senator and congressman. So, wow, what a guy. It's really impressive. So John Glover is our second colonel here, colonel of the Marblehead Regiment from June 75, actually from May, to December 1776. He was promoted in May, but they kind of mobilized in June as General Washington arrived in Cambridge for June, July. And they were a regimental guard with the Virginians. That didn't go so well. And you can read about that a little bit in other sources. But at one point, George Washington, who was very tall, because they were all short in those days, right? Wrong. But George Washington was very tall, and he apparently at one point took two squabbling militiamen or Continental Army men by the scruff of the neck and pulled them apart. So the regiment, Marblehead Regiment's most crucial service was from August to December 1776, mostly just in 3 months. Those are the big 3 months. And for that, he was promoted to general in February 1775. This is an image after the Yale University drawing, which is really faint, but is lovely. He was born in 1732, same year as George Washington. He was, that's his future commander-in-chief. He died in 1797, 2 years before George Washington, who was by that time the former first president. George died on December 14th, John January 30th. If you've probably noticed, a lot of people die in the winter. It's a very tough time for many levels. But the colonel, number 3 of Marblehead's militia, number 3 for our program, the colonel of Marblehead's militia was Colonel Jeremiah Lee. And it was the rebel militia because, as you probably know, militias in every town sort of separated in December, January, 74, 75 into rebel and loyalist camps. And Marblehead was all in. We didn't have a loyalist camp. We had a few loyalists. We had about 12 families that I can count out of nearly 1,000. So that's not many. And they probably got together in one of their houses and said, what are we going to do with these nutcases? What are we going to do about these nutcases? So Lieutenant Colonel John Glover was promoted to full colonel upon Jeremiah Lee's death 250 years ago on May 10th because of his covert activities. And if you're interested in that, which I'm not going to talk about today, I'm going to be doing one walking tour 3 different times in Marblehead on the weekend of May 8th, 9th, 10th, 9th, 10th, 11th. I guess it's Friday and Saturday, 2 different ones, on the anniversary of his death. And no wonder he died. There are many good reasons he died at that time. But it's because of his presence in Concord and Lexington with the Committee of Safety. And that's another story. So he died as the second casualty of an officer in the American Revolution, when you think about it. And hardly anybody knows who this man is. Even people in Marblehead. Yeah, Big Lee Mansion, fancy house. Yeah, I was there in 4th grade. But it's getting a little more mobility. And when I became the director, most of the things I did was to take it on the road up and down the seaport and lecture about it in a lot of different places. So it's becoming more well known. But Jeremiah Lee's a tough nut to crack because there are no documents. Because he was working covertly to overthrow his government and to smuggle weapons from Europe and working treasonously in official capacities. And again, you'll hear more about that if you come to the walking tours in May. Just email me about them and I'll tell you when they are. I'll send you my schedule. His immune system must have been incredibly weak. But he was committing treason in 3 ways. And when the British our regulars marched to Concord through Lexington, they passed right by the tavern in Monotony where Lee and 2 other colleagues on the Committee of Safety and Supplies were staying. And they bailed out 2nd floor windows. And Lee is a very large man and apparently injured an ankle, so he couldn't run. And it's a good thing because the British regulars searched the forest around the tavern and they weren't there because they were stuck because he couldn't run. So, they deride them as hiding in a field of stubble corn, but he couldn't run. And when you are immobile and maybe throw a clot, you get a fever and die. And he died of a fever, and that's all we know. So then Colonel Glover becomes, Lieutenant Colonel Glover becomes colonel, and then later becomes general in 1777, just like Colonel Tim does. Like Colonel Pickering, Glover was one of the few officers who served throughout the American Revolution. This is his house. Gorgeous house. Like George Washington, they had beautiful homes. They were gone for a lot of the time. George Washington for even longer. Understated, elegant. He was 30 years old when this house was built. Okay, Tim, Jeff's age. He was 30 years old when that house was built. He joined the militia in 1759 and was a founding member of the Marblehead Masonic Lodge in 1760. And it's still one of the nicest houses in town. That doorway is gorgeous. We only have about 6 really good colonial doorways because everybody updated in the Greek Revival period and put lipstick on their house and got a brand new doorway. But not everybody had a doorway this nice either. So wow, it's gorgeous, it's beautiful, it's exquisite. He was away for 7 years serving in the entire war and came back, and that whole story is a very fascinating story. But his wife died in 1778. He couldn't come back to her because George Washington wouldn't let him go. And his 18-year-old daughter, he wrote to Washington saying, my children are orphans and they're being cared for by their 18-year-old sister. This happened to a lot of people, I'm sure, but it was a very tough time. After Colonel Lee's death, the Marblehead Regiment served for a year and a half, hard years through December 1776, slogging it out on many occasions. And Glover served beyond that. The most famous occasion, of course, is the crossing of the Delaware River, which the Marbleheaders facilitated and made happen. And then here's the big, really big painting in the Metropolitan Museum of Art about that. The big question, the big joke is, did Washington really stand up in the boat? Well, yeah, they all did, because they were big, heavy barges to haul pig iron up and down the Delaware River Valley rivers. So they all stood up in the boat. But before the December episode, the battle or crossing, and then the Battle of Trenton, was a retreat, another retreat from Long Island, where George Washington would strike and attack, strike and retreat, attack, retreat, attack, retreat. But when you retreat, you need a guard fending off the enemy who's going to chase you. That's what he used the Marbleheaders for, because they didn't flinch. When they're out at sea, fighting a hurricane for 3 days, they can't wimp out. They can't go below. Coffee. They're used to bad rations. They're used to chain of command. They're used to sleeping in uncomfortable places. War was not that much different. And sometimes you didn't get paid in either one. So it was a hard life for them. And then battles in September also. But they retreated from Long Island to Manhattan, and the British were chasing them. But that was over cover of darkness and fog in August 26, 1776. Glover, over there on the far right, the short one, who apparently was very short, was at the surrender battle of Saratoga. If you see the movie, The Crossing, Arts and A&E, remember back when A&E was a channel? They made a really good film with Jeff Daniels as Washington, and I thought he was one of the best Washingtons we've had on film. He was really good, and Glover, that actor, nailed him to a T. Later on, Mount Vernon used him as Washington. He's about this tall. he's really wiry and short. Washington was, really massive and sturdy. But in The Crossing, watch that movie. That's your homework. It's a really good movie. You can find it online somewhere, I'm sure. And Glover accompanied General John Burgoyne home back to Boston after the Battle of Saratoga. And I thought this was interesting. That's where that painting hangs. That Trumbull painting hangs in the Capitol building, and that's January 6th, obviously. From Marblehead, an estimated 1,400 men and boys served the cause of independence in a town of just over 900 families. About 600 right away, and about 1,400 through the war. I mean, wrap your head around that figure. They served with valor, unflinching courage in the face of danger, resilience, even defiance in the face of an attack. So Washington valued that. A Glover biographer later noted, quote, "Few regiments in the entire Continental Army were in more important engagements or rendered greater service." But come December 31st, 5 days after the crossing of the Delaware, they were out of there. They all went on to privateer vessels. They did not sign up again. Glover did, and a handful of others. His adjutant and a few others. And he later married the adjutant's mom after the war, because his wife had died 4 years before, and he and his wife were in love with each other. Oh, man. So at any rate, so many of them became privateers. And later in the war, like halfway through, Marblehead has no vessels anymore. They're sailing on privateer vessels out of Salem. So just like in the 1600s when Marblehead fish made Salem wealthy and powerful, in the Revolution, Marbleheaders on the Salem vessels made Darby and everybody else successful. And after the Revolution, Marblehead was like a third world country. We were wiped out economically. And Salem was thriving and going all over the Pacific. So there's one of the first official privateer vessels which sailed out of Beverly Harbor because, for obvious reasons, Marblehead Harbor is wide open with a warship prowling the entrance, and Beverly has coves to hide in. So there's the Hannah. Beverly and Marblehead, team effort. You proved that, Charlie, for the privateering. Team effort. Marblehead, Beverly couldn't have done it without the Marblehead sailors and captains and some of the ships, and Marblehead couldn't have done that without Beverly to outfit everything. It was very important. So Jeremiah Lee was colonel. I talked about that until his death. Here's his house. Spectacular house. Go see it this summer if you've not seen it before. It took 2 years to construct. It was finished by 1768. Started in 1766. There was a roof on it back then, but it's still that 1768 Lee Mansion. Portrait by Copley. Holy cow. That's pretty impressive. So's his house. Incredibly impressive. I mean, Timothy Pickering, major family here in Salem. That house would knock anybody's socks off. I'd love to know what people said at that time. I have no idea. But I worked there for 17 years in the 27-degree weather, in the 89-degree weather. It never had any heat or cooling. That's why it survived so well. I would never cease to be amazed at how spectacular that house is. The craftsmanship, the people it represented. And there's his portrait right there at the top of the stairs. Gigantic. And there's Martha, his wife, opposite, in a complete fiction there, of course. I don't even know how she felt about this. She might not have even liked it. And I have a theory about her at all, generally. There are their portraits next to a chair in the museum in Hartford, Connecticut, where you can see them up close and personal. Wow. In their full colors. Jeepers. There they are in place. These are copies. Like you have copies of Tim. Thank goodness we have copies. And there it is. You can see the walls a little better, but that glare of that window is too hard to get, so you have to shoot it twice. Lee copied his portrait, had Copley sort of mimic a portrait of Thomas Hancock, wealthiest man in Boston, who died in 1764. And Lee probably said, I like that. Let's do that. And those portraits both mimic a portrait of Queen Caroline that many people had seen in prints. And here's King George. So who looks regal in this picture? Both of them. Both of them. With that gilt ormolu table, or at least gilt table, pure fiction. And yet, Lee threw his lot in with the rebels. He was about 54. General Gage knew him well, which you'll hear more about if you take the tour in March. But on the Provincial Congress, they would say, okay, you Colonel Lee, you go talk to Gage. You're the wealthy one. You're the high-ranking one. And Gage would write to Lee back personally. He wouldn't write back to the Congress because it was an illegal body. So he would write to Lee personally. And there's a great quote that I can't remember exactly because I usually have to read it, but Gage says, "Beware of the rock you are upon." And Lee writes back to him, "Admit or not admit, but times are such that we must be heard."
Wow.
That's grounds for hanging right there. So this man who was so regal stood up to that regal authority. I still get goosebumps. Lee served on the 13-member Massachusetts Committee on Supplies, Safety and Supplies. He was the Committee of Supplies, starting February 9th, just 3 weeks before the episode. But he had been spending the autumn and winter procuring supplies for the rebellion, tents, poles, and Elbridge Gerry too, because he was on the Committee of Supplies. These immense numbers of pounds of raisins and corn and different food supplies. And most of those things, tents, poles, food, and cannon, had been being sent to the farm of Colonel James Barrett. And here's Rick Detwiller's in the audience here. He worked on the restoration of that Barrett farm for years and found so much about Barrett. And Lee writes to Barrett, I'm going to send you 8 hogsheads of powder, and be sure it Colonel Barrett, and be sure and keep it in a good dry store. Well, duh, you know. So Lee must have been a micromanager. And again, I'll read a lot of the quotes of things he wrote in that tour in May. Plus, the Lee's daughter, their oldest daughter, Mary, she got married February 24th. So there's a lot going on this weekend, or that weekend, just 2 days before the regulars march. And it was apparently an event with great fanfare. And yet he's been writing to Europe to get weapons and supplies and sending things to Concord. And my daughter's getting married. I just can't imagine what he was dealing with. So John Andrews is a great source. If you don't know John Andrews, his letters are great. He wrote to a friend, the country towns, that's away from Boston, in general, have chosen their own officers and muster for exercise once a week at least, with the parson as well as the squire standing in the ranks with a firelock, a musket. In particular, at Marblehead, they turn out 3 or 4 times a week, with Colonel Jeremiah Lee, as well as the clergyman, who was William Whitwell at the time, not askance, which means unwilling, to stand in the ranks to learn the manual of exercise. And whose manual of exercise were they learning? Pickering's, you bet. So, J.L. Bell has written about that too. And officers were exempt from standing in the ranks and doing the drills, because they probably knew it already. But Lee's an officer, a colonel, in more status than anything else. So he's got to learn the drill, but he puts himself there. He could have avoided, he could have said, no, you guys practice. But he didn't, he was there. And he wrote his last letter that he wrote to one of his sea captains. He said, if war should break out, find some friendly port abroad, for I shall be in the Continental Army. And I am convinced I will not outlive my life in liberties. Wow. How prophetic was that? And I almost tear up. I wouldn't have wanted to work for him. So Marblehead's first church, like you, first, second, etc. Reverend William Whitwell, Salem's, it was 38, not that old. Salem's Reverend Barnard was 27. And was there at the congregation. King George was 37, so a year younger than Reverend William Whitwell. And William Whitwell lived in this house without the Greek revival door, and his wife died when she was 23, I think, or 30, something like that. He calmly, his gravestone in Latin, that's all this long thing in Latin, says, he calmly expired in 1781, in the 19th year of his ministry, the 45th year of his age. His wife died at 33, 2 years before he got into those ranks, and he probably just figured, what the heck, I have nothing to lose. So the second church was Reverend Isaac Story, whose father had been Elisha Story, son of Liberty, dumping tea into the harbor. So there's a lot of rebelness in Marblehead. Reverend Edward Holyoke, president of Harvard, had been the first minister of the second church. He married a Marbleheader, and he died at age 80 in 1769, before the revolution started. That's a copper portrait. But he says, if any man wishes to be humbled and mortified, let him become president of Harvard. Has anything changed? I guess it was hard then. And King Hooper in Marblehead used to rant. He gave him the riot act because Hooper had been his parishioner. And 3 of King Hooper's sons went to Harvard, wealthy guy in Marblehead. 2 of them were first in their class by rank. The third was not. I'm not sure which one wasn't. But he read the president the riot act over that, because to be first in your class meant your dad was the wealthiest. Not that you were the smartest. There was also an Anglican church in Marblehead, 1714, established and built in 1714 with an M-shaped roof. How cool is that? Really impractical in New England. The rector in 1756, anyway, was Reverend Peter Boers. Before, and then in 75, I don't have a picture, everybody would have looked just the same. Joshua Wingate Weeks was the pastor, and he left. he was one of the few loyalists in Marblehead, of course, and he left. The church got a new roof structure in 1728 because of that M roof being really impractical, and that's how it kind of looked in 1728. And then in 1793, when the steeple was removed, the belfry remained, but the steeple had gotten rotten because of neglect all through the Revolutionary period when the church was closed. But look at those nice round-headed windows in there, which they don't have anymore. They got revival windows, which you can see there in the picture, and some nice long ones on the side. But that's then and now. The steeple was recreated for their 300th anniversary. So minister Thomas Barnard here in Salem at the First Church was there at the bridge, and he was the key guy, I think, who in many ways brokered that agreement. There's his portrait. You can see it in the exhibit at the National Park Service a little bit later in life. There's a lot of information about him. He lived to 1814, so go to the Park Service and read that. And he was 27, just a little bit younger than Pickering. And I love this picture of Jeff sitting there because that's what these guys would have looked like. I think it's really remarkable how young most of these people were. Thomas Gage was the senior member, 56. Jeremiah Lee, 54. Alexander Leslie, 44. John Glover, 43. George Washington, 43. Then you've got King George, 37. Tim Pickering, 30. And Reverend Barnard, 27. Some of the key players in this event, this episode. But also at the bridge encounter, not a colonel, was Salem's Captain Richard Darby. And I came to New England calling him Darby because my museum career was for 8 years in Los Angeles, and he was Darby because that's what they would have said in England. And I came here and they said, excuse me, it's Darby. But here he is. He died in 1783. I didn't realize he lived through the whole revolution, age 71. So he was 63 at that time. He too supplied some of the cannon that were stored in Salem beyond that north bridge. And I wish we could know where that portrait is. It would be nice to see it in color or see it in person. Okay, so now we're getting to number 4, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Leslie, promoted to general in 1776. Handsome guy. He had been lieutenant colonel of the 64th Regiment of Foot since 1766 in England, and he served in America. I believe it was when that regiment came over, which was January 1769. They came over crossing in the winter. Jeez. But when was the Boston so-called massacre? Right after that, right? Because the troops all invaded their town. He was brigadier general, promoted in 1776, died in 1794, just like 2 years and a couple of months, 2 years and 2 months before General Glover, again in the winter. This is a portrait by Thomas Gainsborough from 1776 in a private collection in Scotland. I don't know how that happened because he was here in America and didn't get to go back home. So he must have seen it from, I don't know, how did he do that? But he didn't get to go back home until 1783. So he was a Scottish peer. Someone here has the Scottish roots. 5th Earl of Leven, and died at age 63. He was about 29 when he married his wife, Rebecca. She was a daughter of an Antigua planter, and they had one child, Marianne, and she died. The mother died. Marianne lived, but Rebecca, his wife, died. So he was married a very brief time. She had died well before he got here, and he hadn't remarried. The 64th Regiment of Foot was based at Fort or Castle William in the Boston Harbor Islands from the time they arrived. And there's a map that shows it. There's a little close-up of it. And Cambridge, Boston, Charlestown, and Castle Island down there. It's now connected to the mainland. So Castle Island is where the red Google point is. And it was connected to the mainland of South Boston in 1928. And then there's the airport, not on the Deer Island point, but you can see it, the airport right above what's now Fort Independence, West Castle William. The 64th Regiment of Foot were based in Castle William, but about 400 of them came up to Danvers in the summer of 1774, because the Massachusetts government moved its operation base to Salem in early June that year, and right after Governor General Gage arrived in Boston mid-May 1774. So here's General Gage, new military governor of Massachusetts, in Salem from June 2nd to August 27th. And that portrait's at Yale by Copley. And he was 56 in the war, had fought with George Washington on the same side, of course, in the 7 Years' War, which we call the French and Indian War here in America, even though it was 9 years. and I always get confused because I want to call it the 9 Years' War, but that was in the 1690s. So Alexander Leslie and Thomas Gage, they're well known to each other. They've been in service, and Gage gave Leslie the orders to find those brass cannons that had gone missing. This is about cannons, and it's after the raid on the fort up at Portsmouth on what island is that called? I can't remember. Castle Island there too, I guess. Just like Boston. In December, the rebels had raided that and seized the guns. The powder alarm followed in September in Charlestown, now part of Somerville, on September 1st, 1774, when Gage sent troops, the 64th, to the Charleston Powder House to seize gunpowder that was owned by the Crown. Thank you very much. They're trying to keep their weapons and powder out of the hands of the rebel insurgents because somebody could get hurt. Marblehead had a powder house too. It still stands, 1755, built during Europe's Seven Years' War. And here's a picture of it from the 1920s by J.O.J. Frost. It's out on Green Street, if any of you know that road that connects West Shore Drive to the downtown part of Marblehead. It's near the glue works, the 19th century glue works. But Jeremiah Lee had been instrumental in organizing the construction of that, along with another major and Colonel Jacob Fowle, who died right before the revolution started. And like Richard Derby, he just is almost unknown, but oh my gosh, what a portrait. Yikes. That's a Copley portrait. First Copley portrait in Marblehead. There were 24 portraits by Copley of Marblehead people. Who knew? Yeah. Oh, wow. I don't think a single curator knows that. I need to publish an article. So that was probably Copley's first participant. But this episode was not a first commission in Marblehead. This episode was not a gunpowder raid, despite what Peter Charles Hoffer titled it. It was about finding those brass cannons. And essential, invaluable, 4 had gone missing, stolen from the British regular army. Turns out the ones that were stored in Salem were iron cannons. But Gage was still looking for those brass ones. And they were on field carriages, and then they had to be, of course, removed from field carriages to hide them and so forth. So here are the iron type. The carriages were field carriages as opposed to, that were made locally pretty much, as opposed to ships' cannons. The carriages are stockier and more suited to being on a ship. So you can learn all about that in J.L. Bell's really excellent book, or a recording of his talk at the Marblehead Museum on Thursday last week on February 27th. It'll be on YouTube. But here's where they went. We started a little late, so I'm still going to be running a little bit late, so I hope you're still interested. There's Castle William down in the lower left, and that line from the Park Service Visitor Center exhibit, it's terrific, shows where they sailed, coming into Marblehead. And about 240 troops, roughly. Ashley Bowen, the Marblehead diarist, ship's rigger and maritime shore services, kept a journal for, 60 years. He wrote, "Came a transport from Boston with 246 troops, unloaded at 2 o'clock in Marblehead, and marched through the town for Salem. When they came to the North Bridge, it was hauled up." So he's very terse, unless he's writing about town meeting. But, on this daily basis. And then you'll get all this stuff about all the ship's clearances and town meeting. Daughter Mary died of Nathaniel. On about town meeting. Married my 4th wife Sunday. The transport ship was not the Lively. That's a warship. This was the Sea Venture. It was not an HMS ship. It was not a Royal Navy ship. But this is an image, that's an image that Ashley Bowen drew of a ship in Marblehead Harbor in 1758. But here's an image of Marblehead in 1763. This is awesome. 3 churches, one on the far right, and I think that's right after the first church got its new steeple. Because St. Michael's over on the left already had one. The second church built one very soon on top of its belfry. After it was founded in 1716, it built a steeple very soon. And Old North, off where the Marblehead downtown fire station is on Franklin Street, if any of you know Marblehead, that's where the first church was at that time. And I think they had just gotten a new steeple right before that. But here's a Royal Navy vessel that Ashley Bowen illustrated. I probably should have put that one before the other one. I'll change that if I ever do this again. So the troops arrived in Marblehead Harbor about noon, hid below decks because we've got ships coming and going all the time. Didn't look anything different. Didn't emerge till everybody was back in church for afternoon services. And they marched through the town. Think of that. Marblehead is the 6th most populous metropolis in British North America. And these troops are marching through the town. Why would they do that? Well, maybe it's a show of force to intimidate. Think of Hitler. Think of North Korea. Think of Putin. But also, Marblehead is a hustle and bustle working town. 6 days a week. There's going to be stuff in the way all the time. So a Sunday, they've got a clear path to march fast to Salem. And these are the potential routes. The southern route was published in the in allthingsliberty.com on an article that is so aptly named after that quote, "The Americans have hoisted their standard of liberty at Salem," which was the letter. Who wrote that letter that was sent back to England? I can't remember. Was it John Darby?
That went over the Quero?
Don't remember, but it was an announcement. I mean, didn't he sent the...
Well, Richard Derby sent the Quero over with the notice of
That was
Lexington
Richard Derby,
Concord.
so his son
Yeah.
sent the April 19th notice over. Okay. But I think they probably marched in a little bit of a shorter route. So I drew another route there in the north route. So Marblehead's population is nearly 5,000 people in 1765. In a Massachusetts state census, Massachusetts provincial census that was taken after the end of the war, the 7 Years' War. 935 families, all crammed into 519 houses. Do the math on that. Salem was similar. But the downtown area, that little red splotch, even in 1795, is still contained in our little downtown area. No settlement out on the Neck, the Great Neck. And even in 1872, it's still all crammed into that one little area with the addition of Pleasant Street and the streets around it. That was the shoemaking district. So then there's the railroad that goes to Salem, starting in 1837. So the population of Salem is 4,254 that year. Marblehead is 4,954. That's 750 more people in Marblehead than Salem. Now, granted, a lot of them are deadly as catch guys, right? But that's still a lot of families. And it was 150 working males over 16. 750 people, 150 working males is about the population of the entire population of Manchester up the coast at that time. So that's how much bigger, more populous Marblehead was than Salem. Boston at that time was approximately 16,000. Wonderful image of that. 69, British troops first landed, 68, 69. The population would plunge prior to 1775 as people left Boston in droves and fleeing the occupied city. There were also some troops on Marblehead Neck for a while. New York City was the largest at that time, 20,000 people roughly. An image of New York City. And look at the barge down in the lower right. I think that's really interesting. In the harbors, we had these transport barges. So that kind of makes a little sense of those gondolas that were around the North River Bridge. Philadelphia was about 18,000 in the 1760s. It got to be bigger after the Revolution, capital of the new United States. Charlestown in South Carolina was 11,000. Major fire in 1741 burned a lot of their houses. And in the 1690s, it was about 1,000. So really, these towns really grew, of course, through the 1700s. Newport was also in the 1760s around 11,000. Who knew? But its population also plunged by half, just like Boston's did, because of the occupation. It was 3 years, from 1776 to 79. The British left Boston, pretty much went to Newport. So they left Boston on Evacuation Day, March 16, 17, 1776, and then occupied Newport. Portsmouth had 4,400 in 1767. So they're all, these three towns were all kind of pretty much similar. And then you had Albany, Annapolis, Norfolk, which are all about 4,000. So that gives you a comparison. People describe the streets though in Marblehead: narrow, rugged, dirty, uneven, rocky, and irregular. So not nearly as well laid out as any of those other towns.
What's the fish drawing with the thing? Can you?
Yeah,
That's really-
is that cool?
Yeah.
That is cool.
So there are fish drying over on the tail, right?
Yeah.
That's an area leading up to Fort Sewell.
Ah.
There were flats. So whenever there was a headland or a flat area, fish would be drying on it. And the houses wound, and the roads, well, dirt of course, wound their way around the headlands. They were streets that followed the paths of men's feet, which is so true.
Is this in the collection of the Marblehead
Yeah.
Museum?
Yeah, this is by this artist named J.O.J. Frost.
Oh, that's a really cool piece.
Yeah, it's a very cool piece. And you can actually see our light tower lighthouse from 1835 on the top of the fishtail at the edge. So we have
Oh,
a
and
lighthouse.
that's Marblehead Neck
Oh,
on the far
like-
side, up by the
On the
dorsal
far side is
fins.
Marblehead Neck, and all you see out there are birds. There's no
That's
development. Yeah. And another guy wrote about Marblehead. He talked about the ships of sail. He was here from New York City, a merchant. And he wrote about Lynn. He wrote about Salem. Look him up. Francis Goelet, Goelet, prominent family in New York City. At the end of Marblehead's quote, he wrote, "In short, it is a dirty, irregular, stinking place."
Huh.
Wow.
But when you grow up on a farm, you don't notice it.
Mhm.
So, Dr. Alexander Hamilton wrote about it. I'm not going to read it, but it's a little bit larger than Albany, but not so neatly built. Albany's Dutch, very precise. Again, it's narrow, regular, uneven. So I talked about the families mostly in that downtown area, and think of all those guys, 1,400 or 1,500, coming out of those houses for the next 7 years, feeding into the war effort. And here you have an image of soldiers regulars stationed out on the neck. And I have to look up, I always get confused if that was 1768 or what year that was, but it was briefly. And it absolutely, the war devastated Marblehead. So there's a close-up of the troops, the British troops. So Ashley Bowen also then continued elsewhere in another document, arrived a transport ship from Boston with 234 troops, and that's roughly 240, and landed in Homan's Cove, and marched to Salem and over the North River Bridge and back again, and embarked on board ship again. So here's Homan's Cove. That's looking out at Children's Island, which was called Cat Island then, smallpox hospital, that whole Vineyards thing. Salem is over to the left, way around to the left. This is a view you will never see, ever, because a condo association owns this property and you can't walk on it. But somebody had a condo for sale and it was online. So I grabbed the photo, blocked out the flagpole and the light and all that. And so that British ship would have been parked out in the harbor, in the deep water harbor. Because why didn't they just go to Salem and unload there? Well, I guess they needed a deep water harbor. Because they went to a lot of trouble to march through Marblehead, or they wanted to intimidate Marblehead and show a force. It's a big mystery, but I think it had to do with the depth of the water. But you had big ships going in there. So I don't really understand that, but here we are. So this is looking at Marblehead from the north toward Boston. You can see Boston in the very back horizon there. And there's Homan's Cove. If you picture right below the red arrow is Fort Sewell, which was called Marblehead Fort at that time. Thank you, Rick Detmiller, for all the research you did. And grants that I wrote for that, and we had a good time working on that for about 3 years through COVID. There's an island offshore, and you can see these little, this island in the front is an island at high tide, but they have walkways at low tide. So it's, and the Great Neck, Marblehead Neck, there's the causeway in the background above the word Homan's Cove, and Marblehead Neck is over on the left. There's Homan's Cove again. So a little more perspective. Getting closer in. And those are the islands offshore. Cove. And elsewhere, somebody wrote Homan's Cove on Marblehead Neck. We're going, what? Wait. Huh. Yeah. What does that mean? So there's Homan's Cove again. I think I goofed on a slide here, but let's keep going. There's Homan's Cove and another J.O.J. Frost painting, which I think is awesome, with a few more buildings out on the neck. So this is after the 1830s. There we are. The detail on these on his paintings are fabulous. So if you want to go back, study these on the video and just stop it for a little bit. The wharfs that stick out. There's the transport ship illustrated with troop transport boats unloading the soldiers onto the beach. Close up again. Landing on Homan's Beach. So there's another reference. So that's what it was called. There's the beach. And those are the little condos on the association. So that's the beach they actually landed at. There it is in an old version. That's this area around the corner. And that's what it might have looked like then, because there might have been snow and ice at that point. It was February. So again, Homan's Cove on Marblehead Neck. There's the Great Neck. Was Homan's Cove located where that arrow is pointing? And no, that's very beachy and rocky out there. So it's a real big mystery as to which one it was. But remember I talked about this is where I was going to tell you about the tides coming and going. Where that yellow arrow is pointing, there was a narrow strip of land that got filled in later. And that was also referred to as Marblehead Neck. So I think that explains that term. Boston Neck. Salem Neck.
Yep.
There we go. So February 27th, Ashley Bowen recorded the next morning. This morning, I find the transport gone with soldiers and all. At 4:00 a.m., the transport sailed. So 2 more topics here. Major John Pedrick figures in all the accounts, Peter Charles Hoffer, and all the accounts after 1870s. He shows up in the Rhodes History of Marblehead book. He's everywhere. He's like Colonel Timothy Pickering in the Marblehead History of Marblehead. He warns the regulars. He goes to the North Church. He goes to the bridge. He's everywhere. He was nowhere. He was probably a Tory at that time, and he knew Leslie. He was a friend, which is why they said he could pass by. And Leslie said, "Yeah, sure, go ahead, Mr. Pedrick, or Major Pedrick." And he would have been a major, not in the rebel militia, but in the older militia. So there he is depicted for posterity in the 1920s, and for posterity in Peter Charles Hoffer's book, and then it's going to get reiterated all the time. He hastened on horseback to that town and gave the alarm at the North Church. That means Salem's North Church. Joined by a party of young men from Marblehead, and together they proceeded to the North Bridge. Didn't happen. And J.L. Bell addresses that and why in great detail in his wonderful blog, and so does Donna Seeger. Major Pedrick was a Tory, so check those out. And his wife was the mother of Dr. Joseph. Excuse me. Here's his house. His wife is the daughter of Elisha Story. Doctor, son of Liberty. There's the back side of his house. And he was a textile and retail merchant with an awesome inventory of all kinds of English textiles and goods. But his daughter would have looked like this in the later 1830s or into the 40s when she was telling her tall tales, remembering and recalling the revolution. And not that many people were alive at that point to refute it. Exactly. So she told a lot of tall tales, and even her son said, yeah, she tells a lot of tall tales. But she was the second wife of this Dr. Elisha Story, who came to Marblehead after he was in Salem, after he left Boston, after the Boston Tea Party, went to Salem, then he went to Marblehead during a smallpox epidemic in 1778. His wife died, probably from smallpox, and he married this 20-year-old. And he had 8 children, so he needed to marry right away, and then he had another 8 with her. So, and their oldest was the future U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Joseph Story. And he probably knew his mom, probably rolled his eyes. So she was, JL says, Pedrick's daughter was known for stunning romantic yarns that people weren't even sure she believed. So there's Joseph, born 1779, eldest of 12 children after 8 half-siblings. I'm sorry, she had 12 children. He had 17 children, not just 12. And here he is, love this picture, in old age, died in 1845, age 66. Love that photo. They're buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery. He and his mom, both, who knew? She died in the 40s also. There's another guy from Marblehead, and I'm going to skip through this because it's getting late. He was supposed to have fended off these British at the gate, with his sword, engaged in an encounter. He was a skillful fencer, and with his cane as a weapon, succeeded in disarming 6 of the regulars. Exactly. He was a silversmith, this fencing guy. He was apprenticed as a silversmith, bad fit. But Thomas Grant, his master silversmith, was a captain in Glover's regiment and made this beaker, this can. Beautiful. He was born in 1731, just a year younger than John Glover. MFA Boston, nice piece of silver from him. Here's the Marblehead Museum. And his son, 15-year-old son, was his drummer boy in his regiment. And he was a silversmith apprentice too. So they all had drummers and fifers, we think, but they didn't always have them. So if you look at the ranks, you're not always going to see a drummer or a fifer. But here's some of this silver from the first and second churches. Some's at the MFA, some is in the possession of the first church, to the First Church of Christ, where the Reverend Mr. Story is pastor. So a bunch of silver made by Thomas Grant. And Alexander Leslie, this is kind of the denouement here. He was 44, Glover was 43. They served almost parallel lives. They lived almost parallel lives. They served at Kips Bay against each other. Kips Bay, Harlem Heights, Battle of Brooklyn, Battle of Princeton. There's again, that map, which is again where they fought then. He was promoted to Brigadier General in 1777, as was Colonel Leslie. Glover in 1777 lost his eldest son on a privateer vessel. In March, it says lost at sea. That's a fallen hero. It's a euphemism for he died probably in a pretty bad way. General Leslie lost a close nephew who, in the absence of children, was fighting here in the colonies and was like a son to him. They both lost their wives, one early, one after 8 children. And in 1779, Glover asked leave to return home because his wife had died in November, and I read you that quote earlier. His daughter was taking care of his children, and due to the rigors of his service. When he retired, he wrote, Washington didn't let him out. When he retired, he said to Washington, "When I entered the service in 1775, I had as good a constitution as any man my age, but it's now broken and shattered to pieces." This is what war did. And like General Glover, General Leslie asked leave to return home in 1779 due to poor health, and because he'd never seen his daughter from the time she was 6. And this is like 20 years later. So in 1791, after the surrender of Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown, General Leslie said, "Please now let me go home." But he said, "Nope, you're going to work on the evacuation of all the southern colonies." And he had to orchestrate all of that. 15,000 British forces and loyalists evacuated from the southern colonies. He finally returned home in 1782, just as Glover did, and continued to serve his country. Him in the military, Glover in political office. His daughter married in 1787. He died in 1794, quelling a rebellion in Scotland, and then died soon after. Glover remarried in 1781, and when he got back in 1782, all of his children married. They were all waiting for him to come home. One married in 1780. So, Save the Glover Farm, if any of you know, this is a farmhouse he bought in his retirement. It's Vinnon Square, exactly. It's mostly in Swampscott, but a piece of that property is still in Salem. And he used to joke that he didn't know when he stepped out his front door which town he was in. The 7-Year Revolution left an estimated 400 or so widows in Marblehead, and conditions were abysmal for most families until the 1830s. And the women of Marblehead turned the town around. And you can read that in a book by Robert Booth called The Women of Marblehead. He's the same guy who wrote the book about the house that John built. So if you're interested in women's history in the 19th century and Marblehead, read that. So Thomas Gage, this is his wife, by the way. Oh my gosh, she spelled her right. Margaret Kemble, married in 1758, 11 children. That was the summer house in Danvers where Gage spent time. I'm going to talk about this more at Trails and Sales again, like last year. Here's King Hooper. That was King Hooper in Marblehead's country house in Danvers, the only one who had one. There's his house in town, King Hooper. And it was a farm, like Benjamin Pickman's farm, which is illustrated here below. And it was called the Great House at Danvers, or the Farmhouse at Danvers. But oh my gosh, what a farmhouse!
Oh yeah.
There's the interior. Holy cow! Gorgeous house. Here's the back. And it's now in Washington, D.C., in the Kalorama neighborhood, near where former President Barack Obama lives. Here's the back door. And the front door has a hole in it, a bullet hole in it.
Nice.
There's a WPA mural from the town hall in Danvers that shows some rebels, one of them who took a pot shot at that door. It's a legend, but it's plausible. They were just as mad at Britain as the British government as as Marbleheaders were. And Danvers, of course, militia marched past their house on their way into Boston, and one of them could have just taken a shot at that door as they went by. Because King Hooper was a known loyalist, and later on it became known as the Lindens. That wasn't in the 18th century, but that's what it is now. That's where it is. It's a there was a World War II period house built. But the spirit of those revolutionary people truly lives on in Marblehead. And right there, that man carrying the drum is not Thomas Grant's son. It is Charlie Newhall's son. So I'm going to leave you with that. And thank you so much for your interest.